All right, y'all. We have finally made it to Friday. I am exhausted as heck by the end of the week. I have had less time to work on my videos, and so we are pushing on ahead regardless. Hopefully, this turns out well enough. I am needing to get this out because I need to move on and finish this series. So, welcome in. This is Heather with Underwater Panther. So, I am going to dive right in with Sagittarius. So, we are talking about three different axes with the personality types, the 12 personality types. I am talking about overall masculine and feminine for the archetype itself. So, this key card is considered the ego of the personality type. So, I'm combining astrology and psychology, first of all. Astrologically, you have Jupiter ruling Sagittarius. Now, Sagittarius and Gemini do not have exalted or fall planets in the traditional sense. So, after 10 years, have decided to plug in the North Node, South Node, Sirius, and Chiron for Sagittarius. And Gemini, I include the North and South Node. So that actually gives a heck of a lot of context into the personality and what is going on. So we are talking about astrology. So you have Jupiter ruling Sagittarius. We have the South Node and Chiron in my system in exaltation. Left field is Mercury. And then in fall, we have the North Node in Sirius. Psychologically, you have introverted thinking hero, extroverted sensing parent, introverted intuition child, and extroverted feeling inferior. And then I'm also combining in the inner and outer masculine and feminine quadrants within the archetype's nervous system, how it acts under pressure. There is a distortion pattern that each archetype goes through. So for Sagittarius, that is the distortion order is inner masculine with TI hero and Jupiter. Outer masculine with SE parent, South Node, and Chiron. Inner feminine with NI child and Mercury in left field. And then the outer feminine with FE inferior, Sirius, and North Node. So Sagittarius goes through the distortion order. So the universal integration order goes from outer feminine to inner masculine and then to outer masculine. So Sagittarius is opposite, almost completely opposite in their distortion order versus the healthy integration order. So Sagittarius goes from analyze to act to realize and then to connecting last. And the healthy order is perception, safety, truth, and expression or action, really. I don't know why I have. Okay, well, it is expressive for Sagittarius. So I am going to bring up the key card. I should have done that while I was talking. So I'm going to keep the inner and outer masculine and feminine key card on screen so you can see that throughout the presentation. And I am going to keep Sagittarius's key card up here as well for visual representation. All right, so let's get into it. Before we go any deeper into Sagittarius, I need to anchor what we already established in the first video. So I did do an hour-long video prior to this video because if you missed that structure, this next layer won't land correctly. What we did in the last breakdown was not describe Sagittarius as just a personality. We mapped it as a system under pressure. We separated three different layers that most frameworks collapse into one: the overall masculine or feminine orientation, the moral load, or what the system does with consequence after the fact, and then the internal architecture, the quadrants. That determines what activates first inside the nervous system. Sagittarius only makes sense when all three are held at the same time. If you isolate one layer, it will look inconsistent, it will look detached, it will look like someone who moves too quickly, resolves too fast, and doesn't stay long enough for things to feel complete. But that misreading happens because Sagittarius is not organized around holding experience, it is organized around extracting truth from it. So, first axis is the overall masculine and feminine of the archetype. Second axis is moral load bearing under pressure. Third axis is the inner and outer masculine and feminine containment within their nervous system. All right, so Sagittarius sits at number 5 in overall masculinity in my ranking system, but that needs to be understood precisely or it gets misinterpreted. This is not the kind of masculinity that stabilizes through control like Capricorn. It is not the kind that initiates through force like Aries. Sagittarius expresses masculinity through orientation. They are considered the archer or the centaur with a bow and arrow. It's all about trajectory. So, Sagittarius expresses masculinity through orientation. It stabilizes itself by aligning with something that has proven itself through reality. It does not need to hold the environment in place to feel secure. Sagittarius needs to know where it is going and why that direction is valid. That is what gives it grounding. So its masculinity is not about containment, it is about trajectory. It is about movement towards something that has survived pressure. This is why Sagittarius constantly filters experience through a single question: what actually holds? Not what feels good, not what is socially agreed upon, not what maintains continuity, what survives when tested. Once Sagittarius identifies that, everything else loses structural importance, not because it didn't matter, but because it has already been converted into something usable. The system does not exist to carry experience forward, it exists to extract from it. All right, so moral load, what Sagittarius actually retains. Sagittarius operates in low moral load, and that phrase gets misunderstood constantly. Low moral load does not mean the absence of morality. It does not mean the absence of care. And I'm laughing because hello, Effie Inferior and Sirius and Fall. But anyways, so it does. Okay, so where was I? It does not mean the absence of care. It does not mean the absence of retention. Sagittarius does not store emotional residue across time. It does not anchor itself in relational continuity. It does not carry unresolved weight as a primary mechanism for processing. Instead, Sagittarius runs experience through a loop. It acts, encounters resistance, adjusts based on that resistance, extracts what holds, and then moves forward. Once the extraction is complete, the experience has fulfilled its purpose. There is nothing left to retain because what needed to be kept has already been converted into truth. This is what Sagittarius carries. Not the event, not the emotion, not the relationship, but the principle that survived it. So, hello, TI hero, principles. This is why Sagittarius can appear to move on quickly. From the outside, it looks like detachment or avoidance, but internally, the system has already reached resolution through understanding. It is not leaving prematurely, it is leaving once its process is complete. All right, and this is the key distinction. Sagittarius is not attached to outcomes, it is attached to what those outcomes prove. Motion based nervous system. Sagittarius is regulated through movement, not metaphorically, structurally. Action is not just behavior for this system, it is how the system determines reality. If Sagittarius cannot act, test, or engage directly with the environment, it cannot complete its internal loop. And when the loop cannot complete, the system destabilizes. It becomes restless, agitated, and internally unresolved because the mechanism it relies on to determine truth is no longer available. This is why stillness creates pressure for Sagittarius, not because it is incapable of reflection, but because reflection alone is not trusted. Truth has to be confirmed through contact. It has to be exposed to resistance. It has to be tested. Movement is not optional, movement is regulation. So, distortion order, the actual sequence. Sagittarius does not naturally develop in the healthy order. It develops in a reversed sequence that reflects what the system learned it could rely on. It begins in inner masculine, where it verifies internally whether something makes sense. It then moves immediately into outer masculine, where it tests that internal framework against reality. Only after that does it access inner feminine, where meaning and pattern begin to form. And finally, it arrives at outer feminine, where connection and relational processing occur. So the lived sequence becomes analyze, act, realize, and then connect. This is not preference, this is adaptation. Sagittarius does not trust perception alone. It does not trust feeling alone. It does not trust relational input as a primary source of truth. So it skips those stages and begins with verification. This is why meaning arrives late. This is why connection feels delayed. This is why others experience Sagittarius as out of sync with the moment, because it is not processing in the same order. So, core relational truth. Sagittarius is not disconnected, it is out of sequence. It reaches understanding first and connection second, while most systems require connection in order to reach understanding. That reversal is where the misalignment happens, not in intention, not in care, but in timing. All right, so first, I do want to talk about Sagittarius and Scorpio, because they are polar opposites, and this is where my system is very different compared to others, because I've added south node and north node to the quadrants. All right. So to fully understand Sagittarius, you have to place it on an axis with Gemini, because there are not isolated archetypes. They are two expressions of the same underlying system moving in different directions. Gemini moves laterally. It distributes energy across perspectives, ideas, interpretations, and possibilities. It is not trying to resolve reality into a single truth. It is trying to explore the range of what could be true. Gemini's question is not what holds, its question is what exists as possibility. Sagittarius moves directionally. It filters, it reduces, it takes the range of possibilities and subjects them to pressure until only what survives remains. Its question is not what could be true. Sagittarius's question is what remains true after everything else fails. This is the entire axis. Gemini expands and Sagittarius condenses. Gemini circulates information, Sagittarius verifies it. And this is why both of these archetypes feel difficult. So they do pull from each other. You're going to find each of their downfalls, pitfalls, strengths and weaknesses. They pull from each other, so you're going to see a lot of traits of both in each. So the south node does, in this system, the south node represents default, automatic, relied on, even if distorted. So, what the system falls back on automatically. The north node represents growth, unfamiliar, underdeveloped, and unstable. So the north node is what the system is being pulled towards, but doesn't stabilize it yet. So Sagittarius has the south node in exaltation, north node in fall. Gemini has the north node exalted and south node in fall. So Sagittarius falls back on action, testing, and movement with the south node and SE in with SE parent in the outer masculine. So struggles with connection and attunement with the north node in fall with FE, extroverted feeling inferior, in the outer feminine. So, in plain language, Sagittarius falls back on doing, testing, moving, and figuring it out through reality. Sagittarius is pulled toward so they're being pulled towards slowing down, considering others, emotional awareness, and shared processing. That is their lifelong journey of learning. All right, so Gemini falls back on, let's see, Gemini has north node exalted, south node in fall. So Gemini falls back on shifting identity and external referencing with the south node in fall with introverted feeling inferior. And Gemini reaches towards pattern, trajectory, and deeper direction with the north node with introverted intuition parent in exaltation. So, plain language, Gemini falls back on reactive identity, shifting beliefs, externally influenced values, and what makes sense right now. Gemini is pulled towards deeper pattern recognition, long term direction, internal consistency, and seeing where things are actually going. So, both of these personalities can feel extremely chaotic to others in different ways. So Gemini sees further ahead with the north node in exaltation, but doesn't fully trust or stabilize in it yet. Sagittarius falls back on action and growing towards connection. Gemini falls back on unstable identity and growing towards pattern and direction. I'm sorry, my cat is being extremely loud. So Sagittarius trusts what happens. Gemini trusts what's being processed. But both are movement systems, not containment systems. All right, so I also want to talk about Sagittarius and Scorpio briefly. So before you can understand Sagittarius, and I want to do this because in the zodiac you have Scorpio's number 8, 8th house. Sagittarius is number 9, the 9th house. So you are going to get it's an advancement one step up from Scorpio. But you're still pulling Scorpio like things into Sagittarius. So before you can understand Sagittarius, you have to understand what it inherits from Scorpio. Because Sagittarius is not starting from nothing. It is starting from a system that has already gone through intensity, exposure, and depth. Scorpio does not deal in surface level experience. It goes into the parts of reality that are hidden, charged, emotional, and often unresolved. It tracks what is underneath behavior. It tracks what is not being said. It tracks what is still being carried long after the moment is over. So by the time Sagittarius enters the sequence, truth has already been felt, endured, and exposed. But this is where the split begins because Scorpio and Sagittarius do not do the same thing with truth once they find it. So Scorpio, truth as depth and weight. Scorpio holds truth. So Scorpio is number 2 in my moral load bearing, and they are, I can't remember exactly, they are lower in masculinity. They come off feminine and internally are masculine with FI parent and T child. So you would think that they're kind and sweet and whatever, sassy, but then underneath you're like, oh, oh, okay, this is actually a volcano. Oh, watch out. So Scorpio holds truth. It does not move past it quickly. It does not reduce it. It does not simplify it unless they are totally black and white. It goes into it. Scorpio's system is built to feel the full impact, track emotional consequence, hold what is unresolved, and sit inside intensity until it reveals something real. So when Scorpio finds truth, that truth is heavy, layered, emotionally charged, and tied to consequence. Truth is not just information, it is something that has weight. It carries. Truth is not just information, it is something that has weight. It carries history, impact, meaning, and often pain. And Scorpio does not separate truth from those things. It sees them as a part of the same structure. Sorry, I've got a male cat that is crying like a female. Imagine that. Must be sick or something. All right. I'm just kidding. Man flu. Sagittarius, truth as extraction and movement. Sagittarius receives that same truth, but it does something fundamentally different with it. It does not stay inside it, it extracts from it. Where Scorpio holds the full emotional and relational density of truth, Sagittarius compresses it into something usable. It removes the layers that are not required for forward movement, and it keeps only what can survive outside of that intensity. So, the same truth that Scorpio experiences as this is what this means and this is what it did, Sagittarius experiences it as this is what holds. And once that extraction is complete, the system moves. Not because it's avoiding the depth, but because it has already converted that depth into direction. Where truth becomes weaponized. This is where the distortion happens because when Sagittarius skips the earlier layers, perception and safety, and moves directly into truth, what gets delivered is stripped of containment. The truth itself may be accurate. The problem is how it arrives. It arrives without emotional context, without relational attunement, without timing, without preparation. So you do see FE in the inferior, extroverted feeling. So instead of landing as clarity, it lands as force. This is what people experience as weaponized truth. Not because Sagittarius is trying to harm, but because the truth is being delivered without the layers that make it receivable, relatable. So Scorpio versus Sagittarius, the truth collision. When Scorpio and Sagittarius meet, this becomes very visible because Scorpio is still inside the weight of truth. It is still tracking impact, meaning, and emotional consequence. Scorpio is still holding what has not been resolved. Sagittarius, on the other hand, has already extracted what it needed. It has already reached a conclusion. It has already moved internally. So when Sagittarius speaks, it is speaking from resolution, but Scorpio is still inside process. And that creates the collision. Scorpio hears you're bypassing what this actually is. Sagittarius hears you're staying in something that has already been understood. So neither one is wrong. They are operating in different phases of the same truth. So, why it feels like betrayal to Scorpio. To Scorpio, truth is inseparable from impact. So, when Sagittarius delivers truth without acknowledging the emotional layer, the relational layer, the weight that is still being held, it does not feel neutral. It feels dismissive. It feels like something important is being removed from the equation. Because from Scorpio's perspective, if you don't include the weight, you don't fully understand the truth. Why it feels like stagnation to Sagittarius. To Sagittarius, truth is validated through resolution. So when Scorpio continues to revisit, feel, process, and hold, what Sagittarius experiences is not depth, it experiences lack of movement. Because from Sagittarius's perspective, if the truth has already been extracted, staying in that weight no longer serves a function. So the core difference, Scorpio integrates truth through depth, Sagittarius integrates truth through movement. All right, so Sagittarius in distortion activates outer masculine too early. It moves into expression, direction, and delivery before inner containment is complete. So truth becomes sharp instead of grounded, direct instead of integrated, and conclusive instead of contextual. So this is where truth becomes a weapon instead of a bridge for Sagittarius. So Sagittarius is not replacing Scorpio, it is extending it. Scorpio finds what is real beneath the surface. Sagittarius determines what remains real when the truth is taken out into the world. Scorpio answers, what is this really? Sagittarius answers, what survives when this is tested? And when both are integrated correctly, truth is no longer heavy without direction or directional without depth. It becomes accurate, grounded, and usable. So Scorpio carries the truth, Sagittarius releases it into the world. But and then they get on their soapbox and become a preacher. I'm just kidding. All right. So um alrighty. So that is enough of that. Going to bring Sag back up bigger. Hopefully you can see the distortion order and the key card. All right. All right, so I want to talk about what this looks like for other people. Distortion. All right, so you're in a conversation with Sagittarius and something shifts. It's subtle at first, there's no immediate reaction, no interpretation, no visible resistance, but something in the field changes. You bring up something emotional, something relational, something that requires presence, not just logic. Something that asks them to stay inside the moment with you instead of stepping outside of it. And before anything is said out loud, you feel it. You pull back, or they begin to pull back, not physically, internally. There's a pause that doesn't belong to the conversation anymore, a kind of quiet distance that forms in real time, where you're still engaged, still feeling, still processing, and they no longer are in the same layer with you. It's not rejection, it's not dismissal, it's not even avoidance in the way people think. It's relocation. The system has shifted from interaction to verification. And while you're still in the moment, still trying to connect, still trying to be met, Sagittarius already is somewhere else running something privately. They're asking a completely different question. Not what are you feeling? Not what does this mean for us, but does this actually hold? Is this structurally true? Is there something here that survives pressure, or is this just emotional signal? And you can feel that difference because now you're not being met. Golly, be quiet. I'm about ready to put him outside. He's being obnoxious. All right, so can you feel that difference? Because now you're not being met, you're being processed. He is so spoiled and just like there's no need for it. I can promise you that. All right, in this moment, Sagittarius leaves the shared space not because they don't care, but because their system just prioritized truth over connection. All right, so Sagittarius does not exist in isolation. It becomes visible in contrast because the tension is not created by what Sagittarius is doing. It's created by what the other system is expecting to happen instead. Take a high moral load system. So we're talking about high moral load nervous systems: Capricorn, Scorpio, Virgo, Cancer, Pisces, and Taurus. So take a high moral load system like Cancer, Scorpio, or Capricorn. These nervous systems are not built to move on quickly. They are built to retain, to metabolize, to carry, to track what is still unresolved across time. They don't just register what happened, they register what is still active after it happens. So when something destabilizes, they don't ask what survived. They ask what is still here, what is still being held, what still needs to be processed, repaired, or accounted for. So actually, I'm going to bring up that list briefly so you can visually see what I'm talking about. All right, so this is my moral load ranking order. So Sagittarius is number 10, moral load bearer, tier 4, movement nervous system. Top 2 are structural nervous systems. They hold a lot of moral weight. Capricorn, Scorpio, Cancer, Virgo, they are more relational moral load bearers. Taurus and Pisces are conditional moral load bearers. They can hold moral load, but they tend to absorb. And then the movement nervous systems are down below: Aries, Leo, Libra, Sag, Aquarius, and Gemini. All right, so the higher moral load bearers are asking what is still being held, what still needs to be processed, repaired, or accounted for. And this is where the collision begins because Sagittarius completes that loop internally. It tests, it adjusts, it extracts meaning, and once that meaning is clear, the system resolves. It's done. But the other person is not. They are still inside it, still feeling it, still holding it, still needing something from the interaction that Sagittarius has already moved past. So, what Sagittarius experiences as completion, the other person experiences as abandonment. You're not, you're done, but I'm still in it. And that gap is where the conflict lives, not because one is right and one is wrong, but because Sagittarius and, well, high moral load bearers and low moral load bearers are measuring reality using completely different metrics. Sagittarius tracks what has been resolved, high load systems track what is still being carried, and those are not the same thing. So, what Sagittarius is actually thinking internally, so their internal monologue. When Sagittarius pulls back internally, it doesn't feel like confusion to them. It feels like precision. So, they are an introverted personality type. You have TI hero and NI child. They loop between those introverted cognitive functions, thinking, and intuition. Well, you've got Mercury in left field there, so it's more mechanical. So they do like to tinker physically and mentally. So when Sagittarius pulls back internally, it doesn't feel like confusion to them. It feels like precision because inside the system, there's no chaos happening. There's a very specific process unfolding, one that is quiet, fast, and almost completely invisible from the outside. What's actually happening is this. So they're saying this doesn't fully make sense yet. There's something off here. I don't trust this at face value. I need to test this before I anchor to it. I'm not going to attach to something that doesn't hold. There is a refusal happening, but it's not a refusal of the person. It is a refusal of premature certainty. And once that internal threshold is crossed, the system moves. Not emotionally, not relationally, operationally. So then they say to themselves, let me see what happens. Let me run this. Let me push this into reality and see where it breaks. Let me find out what survives. That is not impulsivity. This is not recklessness. This is calibration. Sagittarius is not avoiding truth, it is stress testing it. The problem is everyone else is still inside the moment, while Sagittarius has already moved into the experiment. So, polarity distortion when this goes wrong. Sagittarius doesn't just act, it often acts too early. So, I'm going to bring back their distortion order. All right, so Sagittarius, they analyze, act, realize, and then connect. The healthy order is perception, safety, truth, and then acting. All right, so Sagittarius doesn't just act, it often acts too early. So they start in the inner masculine rather than the outer feminine with perception. All right, so this is where Sagittarius activates outer masculine before containment is stable. So outer masculine is normally last with action. Sagittarius starts. They start earlier on in the order with action. All right, so Sagittarius activates outer masculine before containment is stable, before perception has fully taken in reality. I'm hoping oh, it's my cat. Okay. I was hoping it wasn't another raccoon running around being crazy. All right, so Sagittarius activates outer masculine before containment is stable, before perception has fully taken in reality, before safety has metabolized what's being felt, before values have actually formed from what's been experienced. So instead of action being the final expression of integration, action becomes the substitute for it. And this is where the distortion becomes visible because now action replaces perception. Certainty replaces safety. Truth replaces integration. And what looks like clarity from the outside is actually premature enforcement from the inside. This is where truth becomes weaponized, not because Sagittarius is trying to harm, but because truth is being delivered without the layers that make it land safely. This is where action becomes escape, movement used to bypass what hasn't been fully processed. And this is where explanation replaces responsibility because once Sagittarius understands something, the nervous system feels complete, even if the impact hasn't been addressed. Not because Sagittarius lacks depth, but because it skipped the layers that create depth in the first place. All right, so if you've ever been told you move on too fast, not because you didn't care, but because you already understood what happened, this is that system. If you've ever felt like people are still inside something that you've already resolved internally, this is that gap. If you've ever been accused of being detached, disconnected, or emotionally unavailable, when in reality you already reached clarity, this is that sequence playing out. Sagittarius doesn't lack processing, it processes differently. And more importantly, it completes that process before most people expect it to. All right, so Sagittarius does not hold what happened, it asks what survived. All right, so now that the full system is clear, we can finally move into the part that determines whether Sagittarius remains adaptive or becomes integrated. Because everything we just described is not wrong. If it is not broken. It is not something Sagittarius needs to get rid of. It is something that needs to be reordered. Oh my gosh, stop. Gosh, he's being absolutely awful tonight. All right, so because everything we just described is not wrong, all right, I'm going to have to get him out of here. All right, come on, Andy. You're going outside. I can't do this anymore. He is too distracting. I apologize. Give me a minute. Come on. Come on. We're going. Come on. Yep. Out. Out. Go. All right. He has been too spoiled rotten. Now I've got to get comfy. Okay, so that was awful. First for everything, I guess. Okay, so now we're back. So I wanted to get into the healthy order because everything we just described is not wrong. It is not broken. It is not something Sagittarius needs to get rid of. It is something that needs to be reordered. And that reordering is what we call the healthy sequence. All right, so the healthy order is not a moral preference. It is not about being softer, slower, or emotionally driven. It is about containment. A stable system processes reality in a specific sequence because that sequence ensures that action is grounded in something that has actually been received, felt, and structured internally before it is expressed internally. I gotta find my phone. I think I'm sitting on it. All right, there we go. All right, so that sequence is at the bottom of the key card. So it's perception, safety, values, and action. So perception with outer feminine, safety with inner feminine, values with inner masculine, and action or expression in outer masculine. So I'm actually going to change that because I think it might be confusing. And I'm going to change truth. Well, it's truth for Sagittarius. So I'm just going to put values. All right. There we go. Hopefully that's still all right. Still good. So the system begins by taking reality in. It allows the environment to present itself before collapsing it into meaning, and then moves inward where what has been perceived is felt and metabolized. From there, it forms values, structured meaning that emerges from what has actually been experienced. And only after all of that does it act. This order ensures that action is not premature. It ensures that force is not being used to replace understanding. It ensures that what is done externally is aligned with something internally integrated. All right, so why Sagittarius skips this? Sagittarius does not skip this sequence because it is incapable of it. It skips it because it does not trust it. Perception feels too open ended. It requires staying receptive long enough for reality to speak before deciding what it means. Sagittarius does not trust that as a sufficient source of truth. Safety requires allowing feeling and internal processing to function as part of meaning making. Sagittarius does not trust that either because feeling is too variable, too ambiguous, and too unverified. So the nervous system adapts. It moves to what it can trust, which is verification. Verification, testing in reality. It builds an internal framework first. Then it tests that framework through action. Only after that does it begin to understand what the experience meant. And only after that, if at all, does it attempt to connect relationally. That is the adaptation. So, what healthy Sagittarius actually does? Healthy Sagittarius does not stop being a verification system. It does not stop testing reality. It does not stop moving. What it does is expand its sequence. It allows perception to happen before conclusion. It allows feeling to exist before action. It includes relational and emotional data as part of what truth is, instead of treating them as secondary or unreliable. And then it does what it actually always has, but cleaner. It verifies, it acts, it moves forward. So, but now that movement is grounded in something that has already been fully received and processed instead of something that is still unfolding. All right, so Sagittarius does not need to become less of what it is. It needs to become more complete in how it processes reality. Because when action comes last instead of first, everything changes. Truth becomes clearer, impact becomes cleaner, and connection is no longer something that arrives after the fact. It becomes part of the process itself. All right, so when Sagittarius is healthy, it does not lose its verification instinct. It does not stop testing reality. It does not become passive. It does not become emotionally driven in the way other systems might. All right, so internally, the system is moving through analyze, act, realize, and connect. But what stabilizes reality is the opposite structure perceive, feel, verify, and then act. All right, so and everything you see from Sagittarius, every strength and every point of tension comes from that difference Because when you start with truth too early, you don't actually get truth. You get conclusions built on incomplete input. And then you end up having to retest those conclusions later through experience over and over again. So, integration is not about becoming someone different. It is about shifting the sequence so that what Sagittarius already does actually holds the first time. There's a very specific moment Sagittarius types recognize when they start seeing things clearly. It's not when they're wrong, it's when they realize they were technically right, but it didn't land. The conclusion held, the logic held, the outcome even proved itself over time. But the moment itself didn't. The person didn't feel it, the interaction didn't stabilize, the connection didn't hold. And that's where the crack forms because Sagittarius starts to see something it normally avoids. That truth alone is not enough to carry reality. And that realization doesn't feel like weakness, it feels like inefficiency. All right, so the outer feminine is what we are supposed to, in a healthy integration nervous system containment order, where we start. So, outer feminine distortion versus healthy. In distortion, Sagittarius skips perception. It doesn't wait for reality to fully present itself. It begins interpreting almost immediately. And from the outside, this is exactly how it feels to others. You're in a conversation with Sagittarius, you're explaining something that matters to you. There's context, there's emotion, there's timing. And before you even finish, you can feel them leave, not physically, but internally. Their face doesn't change much, but something shifts. They are no longer receiving you, they are evaluating you. And what you experience in that moment is distance. It feels like you already decided what this is. You're not actually hearing me. But internally, Sagittarius is not trying to dismiss anything. It is trying to stabilize. It is already asking, does this hold? In the healthy order, that shift gets interrupted. The same moment happens, the same internal impulse to interpret shows up. But Sagittarius does not move forward with it. It stays. It lets the full experience land before deciding what it is. And this is where something changes that Sagittarius cannot ignore once it sees it. There's always more there than initially registered. And what others experience in this version is completely different. Instead of feeling processed, they feel received. Instead of feeling evaluated, they feel included in the moment. And Sagittarius realizes something critical here. Perception is not slowing it down, it is correcting its starting point. All right, so outer feminine. So their outer feminine is extroverted, feeling inferior, Cirrus, and North Node. All right, so in a healthy Sagittarius, the system begins with perception, not conclusion, not analysis, not movement, contact. This is where outer feminine comes online first, not as emotional performance, but as environmental awareness. Sagittarius allows itself to actually register what is happening outside of its internal framework before deciding what it means. Effie here is not about being agreeable. It is about recognizing that other people are part of reality, not interruptions to it. Cirrus softens the system's historical split between care and truth. Instead of assuming that emotional presence is unreliable or irrelevant, Sagittarius begins to treat relational data as valid input, not superior to truth, but part of it. And the North Node here is what makes this difficult but necessary because this is not the default state. This is the stretch. This is a place where the system feels least certain, least efficient, and least in control. So a healthy Sagittarius pauses here longer than it wants to. It listens longer than it's comfortable with. It stays in the interaction before leaving it, not because it's abandoning truth, but because it's allowing reality to fully present itself before it tests it. All right, so then we go from the outer feminine to the inner feminine in the healthy integration order. So in distortion, meaning comes after the fact. Sagittarius something plays out, something impacts someone, and only then does understanding begin to form. This is why so many Sagittarius types can recognize the same internal pattern. I didn't realize that until later. I understood it, but after it already happened, I see it now. Internally, this doesn't feel careless, it feels like completion. Because once Sagittarius understands the system resolves, it moves forward, but externally, the experience is very different because the other person was still inside the moment when Sagittarius moved past it. So instead of acting first and then understanding, it becomes understanding and then acting, and that changes everything. Because now understanding doesn't come at the cost of consequence, like a dumpster freaking fire. Consequences, Sagittarius, I've noticed, they move through life in a very, like, they're on a journey, you know what I'm saying? Like, I've gotta collect them all, like, they want tons of friends, they want to enjoy all kinds of cultures, they're just very, very philosophical, exploratory, truth-seeking, they're wonderful people, they love, arts and culture and music and, you know, all of that. I can't remember where I was going with this. Mhm. Yeah, I can't remember. All right, so it's like super late. Anyways, all right, so the actual inner feminine of Sagittarius is NI, introverted intuition, child, and Mercury in left field. So once perception happens, the system moves inward. This is where Sagittarius begins to feel and pattern what it just took in, instead of immediately testing it. NI here stabilizes something that is normally delayed. Instead of insight arriving after action, it becomes forming before it. Sagittarius starts asking, what is this actually pointing to? What pattern is already visible here? What trajectory is this moving? And Mercury assists not as rapid communication, but as internal translation. This is where meaning starts to form in real time instead of hindsight. And this is critical because in the distortion order, Sagittarius understands after the impact. In the healthy order, it begins to understand before it creates impact. That alone changes everything relationally. This is also where safety is built. Not safety as comfort, but safety as the ability to hold perception without immediately escaping into action. Sagittarius learns to stay inside the moment long enough for meaning to emerge. They are definitely escape artists. They have to have their freedom. They are the wild horse wanting to roam the plains, all plains, wherever they want to. They want to do whatever they want to do. They don't want to be boxed in, caged in. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. All right, so inner masculine. In distortion, Sagittarius forms truth early. So the inner masculine is TI hero and Jupiter. Internal logic, truth verification, and self referenced reasoning. So, in the inner masculine, they're asking, does this actually hold up? They build internal frameworks first, trust logic over people, test truth internally before acting, and seeks what holds up independently. So, in distortion, Sagittarius forms truth early. So, they start with their inner masculine, which is supposed to be third in the step. All right, so it builds a framework quickly, it verifies internally, and it moves forward with it. But because that truth was formed before full perception and internal processing, it often requires correction later. Their consequences catch up to them eventually. So internally, Sagittarius feels certain. It feels like it has clarity. But externally, what others experience is inconsistency. They experience you were so sure earlier, now you're saying something different. Which one is actually true? And that creates a subtle erosion of trust, not because Sagittarius is wrong, but because its truth is forming too early. In the healthy order, truth changes quality. It is no longer formed from partial data. It is formed from fully received perception and internally processed meaning. So when Sagittarius verifies something now, it holds. It doesn't need to be revised. It doesn't collapse under pressure later. And what others experience is completely different. They experience consistency. They experience clarity that doesn't shift, depend on the moment. And this is where Sagittarius begins to step into real authority, not because it speaks louder, but because what it says doesn't need to be corrected later. All right, so inner masculine, TI, and Jupiter. Only after perception and internal processing does Sagittarius move into its natural strength, truth. But now truth is different because it is no longer being formed in isolation from reality. It is being formed from reality that has already been received and processed. TI still verifies. It still asks, does this hold? Is this structurally sound? But now it's working with more complete data. It's not bypassing emotion, it's not bypassing relational context, it's incorporating it. And Jupiter does what it always does. It expands that verified truth into meaning. But now that meaning is more accurate, more grounded, and less reactive, and is less reactive because it wasn't performed prematurely. This is where Sagittarius becomes extremely powerful in a healthy state because now its philosophy is not just tested, it is integrated. All right, so now we move into the outer masculine in the healthy integration order, but outer masculine is second for Sagittarius in their distortion order. So in distortion, action comes too early. Sagittarius moves before the system is fully integrated. And this is where most of the visible consequences happen. Because from the outside, it looks like you acted without thinking it through, you moved too fast, you didn't consider everything. But internally, Sagittarius did think, it did process just in its own order. It verified, it concluded, it moved. The problem is not lack of thought, it is lack of sequence. So action becomes the thing that reveals what wasn't fully processed yet. And that creates correction, re explanation, and often relational repair after the fact. In the healthy order, action becomes something entirely different. It becomes the final step, not the first tool. Sagittarius no longer uses action to figure things out. It uses action to express what is already clear. And you can feel the difference immediately. There's no urgency, no need to fix mid movement, no need to go back and explain what was meant, and it lands. And what others experience is alignment, not disruption, not confusion, clarity. So outer masculine with SE parent and South Node and Chiron. So only after all of that does Sagittarius act. And this is the biggest shift because action is no longer the method of understanding. It becomes the expression of understanding. SE still engages reality. South Node still provides access to movement. And Chiron still refines through feedback. But now the system is not acting to figure things out. It is acting from something that has already been clarified. So instead of act, learn, adjust, it becomes perceive, understand, verify, act. And that changes how impact lands because now action is not disruptive to the environment, it is responsive to it. Sagittarius still moves, it still tests, it still refines, but it no longer uses action to replace the earlier stages of processing. It uses action to complete them. So, a healthy Sagittarius does not become slower, it becomes more precise. It does not lose its independence, it becomes more accurate. It does not stop moving, it stops moving prematurely. And this is the full shift. It no longer begins with what holds, it begins with what is here. Then, what does this mean? Then, what do I believe about it? And only then, what do I do? All right, so this is where everything comes together. Internally, Sagittarius has always been trying to do one thing: find what is true and move forward. That never changes. But in distortion, it does that too early. And what that creates is a gap between what Sagittarius experiences internally and what others experience externally. Internally, it feels clear, resolved, and complete. Externally, it feels fast, disconnected, and premature. And that gap is what causes most of the misunderstanding around this archetype. In the healthy order, that gap closes. Because now what Sagittarius knows internally matches how it lands externally. And that is where the nervous system, finally stabilizes. Sagittarius doesn't lose its nature when it integrates. It still asks what survives, but now it doesn't confuse early certainty with actual truth. All right, so I think that's all I have. I'm at a perfect hour. That is wild. Um, So after this video, I honestly, this is the first time I went through distortion, and that's the first time I've tried to do a video like this. Actually, this I want to get very, very deep into how to practically apply this in real life for each archetype. I think that's going to be like a membership type of ordeal because it will take a lot more work than these presentations, but I do have to lay down the foundation. So that's what this video was, and the prior video. Eventually I'm going to get super, super more deep into healthy integration. I think it's important. All right. So next, I am going to be getting into Aquarius. And so Sagittarius is not the final form of truth. It is the phase where truth gets tested against reality. It moves, it verifies, it refines through impact, but is still dependent on experience to complete its process. And that's where the next system begins. Because Aquarius does not need to test truth the same way. It doesn't rely on repeated exposure. It doesn't rely on impact to confirm what holds. It builds the structure before the test. And this is where the shift becomes very clear. Sagittarius asks, what survives when I run this through reality? Aquarius asks, what system would make this hold before it ever breaks? And that difference changes everything because both of these archetypes care about truth, but they don't trust the same pathway to get there. Sagittarius trusts reality, Aquarius trusts patterns. Sagittarius moves through experience, Aquarius organizes experience. And neither of them are anchored in emotional processing as their primary mechanism. But that doesn't mean they don't care. It means they care in a different direction. Sagittarius proves through truth through movement. Aquarius protects truth through structure. And when those two align, you get something extremely powerful. Truth that has been tested and then stabilized. All right, so that is all I have for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Like and subscribe. Feel free to leave your thoughts and feelings in the comment section below, and I will see you in the next video.